Despite several uncontrolled outbreaks within the NFL, the league is continuing to push ahead with the 2020 season. The San Francisco 49ers are now looking for a temporary home after new California restrictions shut down their stadium. Several other teams are struggling to keep a full roster. Now, the NFL is taking steps to try to halt the impact of COVID-19 on its teams and battered schedule, ordering the shutdown of team facilities today and Tuesday. CBS Sports senior NFL writer Will Brinson is here to walk us through this confusion. All right, Will, so let's start with the Denver Broncos. They were forced to start practice squad wide receiver Kendall Hinton. Why did Denver lose their quarterbacks? And I felt horrible for Hinton because he hadn't played quarterback in such a long time. He was on the practice squad, but he was there. He was there on the field, standing in the line of fire. What do we see?
Yeah, so shout out to fellow 919 native Kendall Hinton. He is from Durham, North Carolina, just up the road from me. He went to Wake Forest. Yeah, he played quarterback there and actually tried to transfer. It turned out nobody really wanted him to transfer to them, but ends up going as an undrafted free agent, lands on the Broncos practice squad as a wide receiver, has quarterback experience. So when the Broncos turned, Jeff Driscoll, one of their quarterbacks, tested positive for COVID-19. The Broncos then went and looked at tape for as part of their contact tracing, and they discovered video evidence of the other quarterbacks in that quarterback meeting room without mask. They turned that video over to the NFL. The NFL on Saturday is like, hey, you can't play any of these guys because that's pretty obvious there. And there's a lot of people in the league who think that the NFL may be making an example of the Broncos here by making them play, reminding everybody that you could lose all four of your quarterbacks, Drew Lock, Jeff Driscoll, Brett Rippon, and Blake Bortles, if you do not adhere to the proper COVID protocols and measures. Kendall Hinton goes out there, he completes one pass, has 2 interceptions, scored -2 fantasy points, didn't have a great day in terms of statistical, but earned the respect of everybody on both sides of the ball and anybody watching, because to do that, to try and play NFL quarterback with zero preparation after being on a practice squad as a wide receiver is just about the hardest thing to do in sports. So props to Kendall Hinton for going out there and giving it his best. The Broncos scored 3 points.
Yeah. Will, you might have to start some stretch and keep your cell phone close because who knows, the Ravens may be calling you. They've been depleted of their starters because of the COVID outbreak. How did this happen? How did this outbreak happen on the team? And how did this, and sort of what's the impact that it's having?
Well, the impact it's having is the Ravens and Steelers game on Tuesday night has been bounced around. It was, of course, supposed to take place on Thanksgiving night, got moved to Sunday, then got moved again, and we found out on Thanksgiving Lamar Jackson, the reigning MVP, one of the, I think, 7 starting offensive players for Baltimore who has tested positive for COVID or is on the COVID list, the reserve list, which means you were in close contact. You see this list of names. I mean, it's wild. And again, those are just 7 offensive starters. You also have multiple running backs. You see all these, Calais Campbell pops up. Matthew Judon was named on Sunday as well. We got a rolling graphic of guys who popped up as landing on the COVID list. Remember, you can be just close contact. You don't have to test positive necessarily, but they will play on Tuesday night. As of right now, the league does not seem inclined to cancel this game. Similarly to Denver, in a sense, there's a strength and conditioning coach who was not practicing proper protocols. The Ravens have since suspended him. The NFL will be investigating Baltimore. It's the impression you get from people around the league is what you might see is that Denver sort of could get some time-served punishment when the NFL hands out its fines. In other words, they had to play shorthanded on Sunday in the original time slot, so maybe there's a reduced punishment for that. Whereas the Ravens, with this outbreak that is, quite frankly, threatening the full schedule of the season, because if they can't play on Tuesday, we're looking at a Week 18 game. I would expect that the NFL investigates the Ravens and that they absolutely hammer them in terms of a fine, punishment, whatever they decide to do, because you know, even if it's not one person's fault, et cetera, even if the Baltimore organization didn't plan on this happening, and obviously they didn't, it's still threatening the entire season. You know, it's the one rotten apple, so to speak, can upend the entire cart. And so I think the NFL is going to come after them pretty aggressively, even if we can play this game on Tuesday.
All right. Meanwhile, the Pittsburgh Steelers were forced to give up their bye week to accommodate the Ravens. This is now the second time this game is being rescheduled. How exhausting is this for the Steelers, and is it fair for them to keep having to reschedule?
No, the Steelers are getting pretty hosed here. And this is not the first time the Steelers have gotten hosed this year. They also got hosed when the Titans, they just managed to run into the two teams that had major COVID outbreaks and had to have their schedule completely upended. However, you're just not going to get a lot of sympathy when you're 10-0. You know, they're undefeated. They're going to win the division. They're going to the playoffs. Mike Tomlin's coaching great. Ben Roethlisberger starting to play really well. Plethora of wide receivers out there with Juju Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson. This is a really good football team. They're undefeated, and that's probably why they're not getting quite as much sympathy. If they're 7-3. Or 6-4, I think people are pounding the table that the Steelers deserve something better. But because they're in such a good spot, it's going to be tough to generate too much sympathy for Pittsburgh. Having said that, I would fully expect that Mike Tomlin uses this as a rallying cry for his team. You know, coaches and players and professional athletes find motivation and chips on their shoulder in weird spots. So why not here? Why not be undefeated and nobody believes in us? They're disrespecting us. I expect you hear a lot of that. The Steelers will be fired up to keep playing well down the stretch, and they need to because Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs are nipping on their heels.
The New Orleans Saints, they're being fined and stripped of a draft pick for violating COVID guidelines again. You pointed out that several teams have found themselves in this predicament, flouting the guidelines. So I got to ask you, are these punishments enough to get the teams to follow the rules? And how severely does this now impact New Orleans?
Yeah, this isn't a huge deal for the Saints in terms of how it'll impact their season or how it'll impact the future of the franchise. It's expensive, and they lose a later round draft pick, but not a huge deal. It is a message, though, that the NFL is sending to teams. The Saints was essentially a punishment. And Sean Payton had already been disciplined, I believe, in terms of financials. So, I mean, 7th round pick, really not a huge deal. As you see, $350,000 for Sean Payton. Now $500,000 for another protocol violation. And this violation of the Saints, the second one, was for having a maskless dance-off in the locker room after a big win over I think it was the Buccaneers game. It all kind of blends together at this point. So it wasn't like they were out at a bar, not wearing masks and just flaunting it. It was in the locker room, and that's how serious the NFL is taking these protocols and these measures. They have now told everybody on the sidelines, when you're not in the game, you need to be wearing masks. You see these shots of Drew Brees. That was before they escalated those protocols. And I just think you're going to see the NFL continue to do this. They want these teams getting in line, practicing very strict protocols, because the reality is while a maskless, dance party in the locker room probably is not going to be a cause of spreading COVID with a bunch of people who've already been tested negative multiple times leading up to the game, you need to have the mentality that approaching these guidelines, approaching these protocols in a proper and strict way is the only way that the NFL is going to complete its season. And that's why they're looking at the possibility of going into bubbles for the playoffs, potentially keeping teams more isolated. It's a little difficult because of the personnel involved, but the NFL understands what's at stake here. It understands that the league is sort of teetering on the edge, just looking at the season and the outbreak of cases across the country, the outbreak of cases across the league, and that they need to ratchet up the strictness and the severity of the punishments for people who violate the protocols.
Yeah, because, short of canceling a game, Will, which they haven't really done, and I get that there's big money involved and there's a lot of connections with football. It's like network television and contracts, and there's a whole web of economic repercussions if they do something like that. But the flip side is more and more people are testing positive. Players aren't taking it seriously. And, let's not forget, these are highly paid professional athletes, but they're also really young. A lot of them are in their early 20s. And I remember what I was like in my early 20s without any money. So imagine you've now got, some sizable bank account, what that would mean when you're seeing this. And also you're paid because you are like a perfect, and I use the word perfect like in quotes, but you're like a perfect specimen. You're healthy, you're strong, you're fast, you're all these things that make you think you're in better shape than, the average, guy who sits on his couch like me every weekend and watch them play.
Yeah, and look, there are different rules around the country as it relates to what you're able to do. Hypothetically speaking, you're one of these strapping young lads who suddenly has a bank account stuffed full of cash, and you're single and you live in Miami. where they are a little more lax than maybe they are up in New York. Well, I mean, look, you can point to several cases where teams have, by the way, teams from other states have come down to Florida and maybe had a slow performance out of the gate, which leads you, it's just tough. Vlad, your point, thinly veiled, however it may be, is spot on accurate. Like, these guys are young and rich, and they've been locked up in their houses, and it's hard to maintain, the integrity of that bubble. I will say that I think they've done a good, and the other flip side of it too is, look, a lot of these guys have kids who are going back to school in different areas, and this virus is transmitted in strange ways in terms of how it eventually moves on across the country. So it's just hard, and the NFL players have done a pretty good job, all things considered, for this full season. But yes, the league does not want to cancel a game. And what would have to happen if they canceled a game is then we would move to a Week 18 scenario, whereby they would have to play any remaining games the week after the season. And once that happens, you talk about the web of broadcast contracts, which above our pay grades, right? You suddenly start having to push back the Super Bowl. You have to push back the playoffs. Well, the sort of butterfly effect of all of that, and it's manageable because there's not a whole lot going on in the country, is just, you're impacting literally hundreds and thousands of jobs and locations and different financial situations. So I think the NFL would love nothing more than to keep the schedule intact, to finish in Week 17, maybe take a timeout and push for the playoffs, give a week break for the playoffs or a 2-week break for the playoffs, depending on what, if they want to do that and go to the bubble situation. I think there's still TBD on that. But absolutely, the league does not want to cancel a game, and that's why it is hammering these folks who violate the protocol.
It makes sense. Will Brinson, thank you so much.
All right, guys. Maybe next week we'll talk some football. Hopefully we can get this thing under control a little bit as it relates to the NFL.
Yeah, right.